Good morning, everybody, brothers and sisters, visitors alike. It's so good to see you all. I'm glad that you're here. There's a million other places you could have been this morning, I guess chief of which is your bed, but you're here instead ready to worship God together. And for that, you should be commended and encouraged as well. I've had the opportunity to preach over the past couple of months, and both of my sermons hit on the book of Nehemiah. About a month ago, we looked at prayers of the Old Testament, and as a part of that study, we took the time to read Nehemiah's prayer in the first chapter of that book. We noted how Nehemiah addressed God, how he praised God, and he had reverence for him. We noted how he reminded God of the promises that he had for his people as long as those people were obedient to him. These were areas that we noted that we could work on in our own prayer life to incorporate. And then the week before last, we talked about the importance of being focused. And we used Nehemiah as, a case study in how to stay focused, especially how to say no when people are trying to take your time or to distract you from the work God has set out for you to do. We saw in Nehemiah chapter 6 how his enemies tried to distract him from his work of rallying the people, of guiding the people to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. But Nehemiah was not swayed. He wasn't distracted by his enemies there. He was focused on God's work. And hopefully those that listened to that lesson were able to find, that one area of your life that you want to work on, not being distracted in. What's that distraction that we could work on removing? But as you can see, I've been in the book of Nehemiah lately. And so this morning I wanted to take the time to look one more time into this book and look at one. I think the major defining characteristic of Nehemiah, and this is a characteristic that I think we all can learn from. But before we get to this characteristic of Nehemiah, I want to give the historical background of his story, because I think it's important and I think it does matter when we're looking at his character. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah, these were one book in the Hebrew writings. And in our Bibles, now we have two books, but it's really one story telling the story of the Israelites when they returned to the land of promise after being in captivity. See, the Israelites, they were wicked and they lost their way. And so God had the Babylonians come and take them away, but God is faithful. God had promised them that one day a remnant would return to the land. And so that's where the book of Ezra picks up. The 70 years of captivity has come to a close, and the King Cyrus, he sends these people back to the land. And so about 40,000 Israelites, they go back to the land to rebuild under the direction of a man named Zerubbabel. And they go back, they rebuild the temple. And a little bit later in the book of Ezra, we meet the character of Ezra, and he goes back to the land, and he helps with the spiritual focus of the people. Namely, he talks about who they're marrying and who they're supposed to be marrying. We can go into a lot of detail there, but we won't. But he helps to rebuild the spiritual culture of the people. And then we get to Nehemiah. Nehemiah's day would have been about 90 years after that. The first 40,000 went back to the land of Judah. And so it's there in Nehemiah chapter 1 that we learn that the walls of Jerusalem are still in ruin. The walls are still torn down, and God's people are still vulnerable to their enemies. And so that's the context that we find ourselves in. I want to read again for you the first 4 verses of the first chapter of Nehemiah. The Bible has this to say: "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. So it was when I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And at this point, Nehemiah prays the prayer that we read previously. But at the end of verse 11, there's an important note about Nehemiah's profession. There's an important note about his profession. The Bible says that Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. Nehemiah was the king's cupbearer. If we're reading it, I guess in an American context, that sounds kind of mundane. What is he, just the king's bartender? What is a cupbearer? No, this is a very important position in the kingdom of Persia. The job of the cupbearer was to serve the king, to pour his drinks, and to also taste them before he gave it to the king, as to keep the king from being poisoned, because obviously the king had enemies. His duty was to supervise, to pour, to taste the drinks, to make sure they didn't have poison. And so the cupbearer was a highly ranked individual who had a most serious responsibility of protecting his master, not only the king, but his family, and also the guests of the king. If any guests come to eat with the king, it's the cupbearer that's ensuring no shenanigans are happening, nobody's being poisoned and things like that. So as such, the cupbearer was someone who was influential, because this is an individual that would be around the king all the time. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, anytime in between, the cupbearer is there. He's making sure that the king is safe. And so this individual is probably someone that would be wealthy, someone that's very taken care of, right? Because this is the one employee that you don't want to be disgruntled, right? The person watching over your well-being, you want that person to be taken care of. So you take care of the cupbearer. So this is the context. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And so I think this context helps us understand the rest of the story, especially once we get into chapter 2. And I want to read the first part of this chapter for us. Nehemiah chapter 2, beginning of verse 1. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, since you're not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." So I became dreadfully afraid and said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" Then the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the king, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." Now let's stop here. Before we go too much further, I want us to note the predominant trait of Nehemiah that we all can learn from. Nehemiah was a man who cared. Nehemiah was a man who cared about God's work. Did you notice that about Nehemiah? Nehemiah cared about God's work. Notice how in the second verse of the book, Nehemiah asked about what was going on in Jerusalem. Nehemiah cried about the state of Jerusalem. Nehemiah prayed for Jerusalem, and Nehemiah wanted change for Jerusalem. Even though he had probably never been to Jerusalem before, even though he had most likely never seen the temple with his own eyes, even though he was unlikely to know personally too many people there in Jerusalem, even though Nehemiah was far, far away from that city, he still cared about it. He still cared about it. He cared for God's people, and he cared for their progress. Nehemiah cared about God's work. And this is the focus for us this morning. This is my question for all the Christians that are in this room. Do you care about God's work? Do you care about God's work? Now, of course, if I did a survey of everyone here in the room, what Christian would say no to this question, right? Of course I care. Of course I care about God's work. But let's put ourselves to the test. Do you care about God's work the way that Nehemiah cared about God's work? This morning we're going to compare ourselves to Nehemiah, and we're going to see how Nehemiah cared. How do we know that Nehemiah cared? What attributes tells us and shows us how much he cared? And then we'll see in the end if we stack up to this. So first, how do we know that Nehemiah cared about God's work? We know because he asked about it. We know because he asked about it. Again, Hananiah came back from Judah, and one of the first things Nehemiah did was ask him about the people. Ask him about the land. He wants to know about their welfare, about their status. He wants to know, how are they doing? And I want to point out that, again, that this is a very interesting thing when we understand Nehemiah's job. Going back to the fact that he's the cupbearer to the king of Persia. He's not just some ordinary Jew, living in the capital. No, he's a very important Israelite. He's working with the king. He's right next to the king on a daily basis. He's the cupbearer. He's an important person. But despite his position, despite his status, despite the fact that he's probably living very comfortably, getting all the meals that he wants, his mind is on God's people. His mind is on God's work. His main job is the protection of the king, but his mind was on the holy city. And so the question is there. Do we care about God's work? If you do, if we care like Nehemiah, then the question is, do we ask about God's work the way that Nehemiah asked about God's work? Do you care about the spiritual growth of this church? Do you care about this congregation prospering and surviving for decades to come? If you do, then you'll be asking others about what they're doing for God in this place. If you are asking about God's work, then that's a sign that you care like Nehemiah. If we really care about the work of God like we say, then we'll find ourselves doing exactly what Nehemiah was doing here in the scriptures. I'd like to give you an example of where I saw this in this church. I was in the nursery with Maxwell just, I guess, maybe last week or the week before, and the door was closed. I was in there with Maxwell, and I overheard a conversation. Now, I hope this isn't gossip or anything like that. But I was in the room, and I heard in the hallway one of our sisters asking another sister, "Hey, I heard so-and-so had a Bible study. How's that Bible study going?" She was excited to hear about it. One of her children came up to her and was trying to get her attention, and she told the child, "Hold on, I'm trying to find out about this Bible study. Isn't this exciting?" Yeah. That sister cares about God's work. How do I know that she cares about God's work? Because she was asking about God's work, the same way that Nehemiah was asking. If we really care about the work of God like we say, then we'll find ourselves doing what Nehemiah was doing, asking questions about God's work. If we care about God's work, then we're going to notice those people that haven't been here in a while. I'm going to call them, and we're going to ask a few questions. We're going to ask them in love, and we're going to ask them, how are you doing? Ask them if there's any way that we can serve them. If we care about God's work, then we'll be asking our elders and our deacons, how can I help? What can I do to help this church grow? Is there anywhere you can plug me in? Is there anything you need me to do to lighten your load? We'll be asking every now and then, what can I do? If we're going to be like Nehemiah, then for those that are newly converted here, we'll be asking questions of them as well. We'll be asking them every once in a while, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? Is there anything testing your faith? Do you have any questions about the Bible that I can help answer for you? When it comes to those we come in contact with every single day who are lost, who are not Christians, if we care about God's work, then we're going to be asking them some questions too. We're going to be asking them questions like, would you like to come to services with me on Sunday? Do you have any questions about the Bible? Is there any way that I can help you? See, if we're a people who truly care about God's work, then we'll ask about it. We'll ask about it. If we care like Nehemiah cared, God's work will be the first thing on our mind. How do we know that Nehemiah cared about God's work? He cried about it. He cried about it. After Nehemiah received that bad news about the walls of Jerusalem still being torn down, what did the Bible say in chapter 1, verse 4? It says, "So it was when I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven." And again in chapter 2, verse 2, he was so sad that the king of Persia, he noticed. He asked Nehemiah about this. "Why is your face sad since you're not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart." You know what it looks like when someone is upset. Nehemiah cried, he wept, he mourned for days. That is how emotionally invested Nehemiah was for God's work and God's people. If you care about God's work the way that Nehemiah cares, then you'll be emotionally invested in it. Consider all the things that we find ourselves emotionally invested in. For some people, they get very emotionally invested in their sports teams, don't they? Sometimes I may find myself in this category. They follow a team, that team loses, and then the rest of their day is ruined. They may go to work the next day, and they have a bad attitude, a little bit moody because their team lost the day before. For some people, they're emotionally invested into politics. For some people, they're just so focused on watching the news and seeing this or that, and their emotions are moved this way and that way. For some people, they're emotionally invested into their TV shows or their games. To my fellas that play video games, if think of the game that you spend the most time on. If all that data just disappeared, how would you feel? I know I'm in that category too. I might feel a little bit empty. So it's amazing what we can get emotionally invested into. But really, in the big scheme of things, most of those things are trivial, right? But what about the Lord's work? What about the Lord's work in this place right here? Brothers and sisters, are we emotionally invested in this work? Do we lose sleep or do we shed tears from time to time for the Lord's work? When we learn that someone's been baptized for the remission of their sins, does that cause your soul to leap for joy? Do we celebrate that? Does that news, just get you on fire and makes you want to go out and spread the word more? What about the opposite? When the elders have to come up and tell us, well, this person, we have to disfellowship them because we've reached out to them and they don't want to be a part of us anymore. They don't want to be a part of God's church. When we hear that, do we cry? Does it hurt us on the inside? Understanding the seriousness of that situation? Before it gets to that point, when we see someone sliding back into the world, someone that's just coming in infrequently, do we lose sleep over that? Does that cause us a little bit of stress? Does that cause you to want to reach out to them and understand them and see how you can serve them? I'd like for us to consider 2 Corinthians chapter 11. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, in this chapter, in verses 23 through 28, we see that Paul is recounting all the hardships that he's gone through for the cause of Christ. And you know the list. You've read it before. He's been shipwrecked. He's been beaten. He's been robbed. He was in prison. And I want to note what he says in verse 28 and verse 29. He says this, "Besides the other things, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble and I do not burn with indignation?" Did you catch that? Paul he lists all these horrible things. I've never been robbed. I've never been shipwrecked. All these things, I can't imagine going through all those things. And at the beginning of the list, he lists death in there too. He's been on the verge of death. But in that list, he lumps in his deep concern for the church as a hardship for him. Paul's concern for the church was so intense that being robbed, being shipwrecked, being on the verge of death, his concern was equal with those things in his mind. Paul said when he hears that someone is made to stumble, When he hears that someone is being pulled away from God, he burns with indignation. See, Paul was someone that was emotionally invested in God's work. Are you emotionally invested in the work of the church? The way that Nehemiah was emotionally invested? Are you emotionally invested the way that Paul showed that he was emotionally invested in God's work? Do you truly care? Nehemiah cared about God's work. We know that he cared because he cared enough to ask about it. We know that he cared because he cared enough to cry about it. We also know that he cared because he cared enough to pray about it. Several times in the book of Nehemiah, we find references to his prayers. We already read the one in the first chapter. We see his very quick prayer in chapter 2. He prays again in chapter 4 when the workers were facing ridicule. He prays again when they discovered the enemy's plot. He prays in chapter 5, verse 19, chapter 6, verse 9, chapter 6 and verse 14, chapter 9, verses 6 through 38, chapter 13, verse 14, chapter 13, verses 22 and 29 and 31. In the context of every major decision or activity in this book, we see that Nehemiah is praying about it. He's praying about it. Nehemiah, see, he embodies what we read in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17. And you can say it with me if you know it. Pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. And I love the little prayer that Nehemiah does before speaking to the king. After the king asks him what's wrong, he says his little prayer in his mind, and then he tells him. And parents, I know you're probably familiar with that prayer too, right? Your child does something, and you need to stop and say a little prayer in your head before you respond. There's much we can learn from that there. But over and over again in this book, we see Nehemiah praying, "Remember me, my God, for good. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Remember me, O my God. Remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of your mercies." Constantly, Nehemiah is asking God to remember him. Nehemiah constantly wants God to watch over him, his actions and his words. So what about us? What about me? What about you? Do you care like Nehemiah cared? If so, then your prayer life is going to look a lot similar to Nehemiah's. If you care about God's work like Nehemiah, then you'll be praying for the work here in this location daily. Are you praying for the elders? Are you praying for the deacons? Are you praying for the class teachers that we have? Are you praying for those that are having Bible studies? Are you praying for more opportunities for yourself to be able to study with others? Are you praying for our new converts and their spiritual growth? Are you praying for our youth? Are you praying for the lost to find truth here at South Seminole? Are you praying for God's word? Do you care like Nehemiah cares? We know that Nehemiah cared because he asked. We know that Nehemiah cared because he cried. We know that he cared because he prayed about God's work. But lastly, we know that Nehemiah cared because he acted. Nehemiah cared, and we know it because he was a man of action. Once you get past Nehemiah chapter 2 and verse 4 that we just read, the rest of the last 12 chapters here is all about Nehemiah's actions and what he did for God. Going back to chapter 2 and verse 4, the king asked, "What do you request?" And it says, "So I prayed to the God of heaven," verse 5, "and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it." I heard growing up a lot, and I repeat to my children, actions speak louder than words. And that's a proverb that is certainly true. Actions speak louder than words, don't they? Nehemiah was a man who cared. And we can see that through his actions. I want to note a few verses that just demonstrate his faith, the faith that he had that moved him to act. In chapter 2 and verse 20, it says, "The God of heaven will make us prosper and we, his servants, will arise and build. You can see his confidence here. Chapter 4 and verse 14, and I looked and arose and said to the nobles, to the leaders, and to the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Chapter 4 and verse 20. Great servants of God don't trust in themselves, but in the God who made them. Great servants of God are doing just that. They are servants. They're serving. They're doing an action. They're doing something. Serving is a verb. My limited knowledge of the English language, I understand that. Just like arise and build and fight and rally, those were all verbs. And we can see Nehemiah doing those things. And not only was he acting, he was encouraging everyone around him. Act. Do something. Be about God's work. Nehemiah is a book about a man that not only saw the need for God's people, but he got up and he did something about it. He got up and did something about it. Although he was there in the capital, although he was the cupbearer, although he was probably very comfortable, again, where he was, the king asked, what is it? What do you want? He said, send me. Send me. I will go. I will help rebuild. I will rally the people. And we see that in this book. And so here's the test. What about us? Do we care like Nehemiah cared? Do we care to the point of action? Unfortunately, sometimes we can find ourselves, instead of doing something and having action, we're tempted to complain about things that are going on or things that may not be going on in the church. And some of these complaints, sometimes they may be valid. But are you going to complain just to complain, or are you going to do something about it? Oh, I don't like the singing in this church. Well, why not invite some people over to your house and sing with them? Maybe teach a new song in your home and then teach it to others. Well, I think the preaching's a little stale. Well, do something about it. Why, men, get up and preach. Maybe send a lesson to the preachers so we can know, oh, hey, this is a good lesson here. I could preach about that. Maybe you're here to complain, I don't think we're doing enough evangelism in this church. We're just not growing. Well, then go out and spread the gospel. Take a brother or sister with you when you go, when you're studying with somebody. Take one of your brothers and sisters with you. Show them how it's done. Maybe encourage them. Ask, like we already talked about. What are you doing for God's work? Oh, I don't think we're doing enough for the kids here. Well, let's get up and do something. If you see a problem, be a part of the solution. That's what Nehemiah was all about. If you see something, some area, some part of the Lord's church that needs work, get up and fix it. Do you care enough to act? Be like Nehemiah. He personally got up and made things better. He personally did that. He didn't just complain to Hananiah about it. Oh, man, I hear that's going on in Jerusalem. Well, I hope they get their act together. No. He didn't just think about it to himself. He didn't just talk to God about it. He could have left it there. He could have prayed about it and said, okay, I'm going to let God handle it. But no, he didn't just leave it there. He got up and he did something about it. That's the sign of a man who cares about God's work. And so the question this morning for all of us is, do you care the way that Nehemiah cared? Do you care about God's work the way that Nehemiah cared? Ask, cry, pray, act. If you cared like Nehemiah cared, then you'll be asking. Be asking about God's work. It'll be on the forefront of your mind. Asking how you can help, how you can be a part of God's work. If you care like Nehemiah, you'll be emotionally invested like he was. Some things are going to make you jump for joy. Some things are going to make you cry. If you care like Nehemiah cared, then you'll be praying constantly like he was, praying about God's work, praying for others. If you care like Nehemiah cared, then you'll act. You'll act like Nehemiah did. For those of you who are not Christians this morning, I ask you, why not? There are many that are emotionally invested in your soul, that are crying for your soul to be cleansed. There are many praying for your heart to be convicted of that sin and for you to act. Act this morning before it's eternally too late. But for those of you who are Christians here, again I ask, do you care? Put yourself to the test. Compare yourself to Nehemiah. If anyone has any need of the church or would like to make it known to us, we invite you to come forward as we stand and sing for your encouragement.